Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. Last week I talked about that divine movement called ousia, which is the dynamic creative force in the unfolding of reality. Today what I want to talk about is motion in our physical world and look at how the Platonists deal with it in our metaphysics. So I find this to be an interesting topic, and I hope you do as well. For today's video, I'm going to draw from Proclass because he's really the one who unfolds metaphysics in tremendous detail. A lot of what we do in the study of metaphysics is we pull reality apart and give it lots of different names and organize it in ways that help us understand it. And then the idea is to put it all back together in a way that helps us see what we couldn't have seen before we had pulled it all apart. And Proclass really is a master at this. So anyone who wants to understand Platonic metaphysics really needs to get into Proclass. I think his theology of Plato is a must read. And so I'm going to be drawing from him. And for those of you who have the book, the excerpts that I'm going to use in this video are from Book 1, Chapter 13. And here is where he introduces what is known in academia as the 4 hypostases of motion. A hypostasis is basically like a level or a realm. And what he shows in this section here is that they're necessarily placed in an ordered series, one after another. So this is a complex topic here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down into bite-sized pieces. So first, we're going to pull from his works here to see some names that we can put on these 4 hypostases and see what order he puts them in. And then we want to go back and see if we can match them up to realms of reality to get a better sense of what's going on in each of these hypostases of motion. And then at the end, what I want to do is try to put it all together so we can better appreciate how these 4 hypostases of motion function together in our physical world. Okay, so first step here is to just see the order of the series, put some names on it and give them an order. So first he starts with talking about that which is moved only and suffers. And by the way, this translator, Thomas Taylor, he wrote in the 19th century, so he's using an old use of the word suffer here. He's not talking about pain and suffering. He's talking about passively experiencing. So it's that which is moved only and experiences passively, and it's depending on other primary causes. The next one is that which moves others and is at the same time moved. So he puts the moved only at the very bottom. And then above that is that which is both active and passive. And we're going to just build up. And so the third one from the bottom is that which is self-motive, and which is beyond that, beyond in the metaphysical sense, of course, that which both moves and is moved. It begins from itself, and through its own motion, it imparts what he calls the representation of being moved to other things. Now, I'm going to come back to this excerpt later in the video when we're looking at what exactly is going on here and the way they interact with one another, because it's hard to understand what he's talking about here. But what we can see so far is that the next category is the self-motive, and we see that it is beyond that which is both mover and moved. And so coming back here, we're going to add the self-motive. And then we see that we still have one more to go. So what is that? He calls that the immovable. And it precedes, again in the metaphysical sense, it precedes whatever participates either producing or passive motion. So it's beyond all motion, active or passive. And so coming back here, we're now going to add the immovable. So now we've got all 4. So even if this is your first introduction to this area of study, you've got all 4 of them. You can impress your friends. Hopefully they won't ask what any of it means and you're good to go. But I think we all want to know a little bit about what's going on here. So let's get into this here. Now first I'm going to start with the self-motive, because if we see what that is, then we'll see how it moves other things and we'll see why it needs a cause. For this one, I'm going to turn to Plato because in his Phaedrus, he talks a bit about the self-mover. And he says that the self-mover is the first principle of motion. And it is as impossible that it should be destroyed as that it should ever come into being in the first place. Now, this follows actually a passage where he talked about it can't come into being because it would have to move. And if it's the principle of motion, then how could it ever come into being? And now he's going to show that it cannot be destroyed. Because if it could, then the whole universe, the whole of that which comes to be, would collapse into immobility. And it would never find another source of motion to bring it back into being. So it has no beginning and no end, which means that it is immortal, it is never ending, it is infinite. And so now we have seen that that which is moved by itself is immortal. And so we shall feel no scruple in affirming that precisely that is the essence and definition of soul, to wit, self-motion. So he defines the self-motive as soul, and soul is self-motive. And any body, any physical body that has an external source of motion is soulless. A body such as this glass, it has no soul, it's moved from outside. But a body such as our own, deriving its motion from a source within itself, is animate or besouled, which implies that the nature of soul is what has been said. And so coming back here, we see that the self-motive then lines up with the realm of soul. So now we have to ask ourselves, if soul is the principle of motion in the physical world, then why does it need an immovable cause? Here's what Proclass wrote. He says that everything self-motive, in consequence of possessing its perfection in a transition and interval of life, depends on another more ancient cause, which always subsists according to sameness, and in a similar manner, and whose life is not in time, but in eternity. Now, for those of you new to metaphysics, this probably just looks like a word salad. It's very hard to get into Proclass at first. So we're going to break it up into pieces. So we know the self-motive is soul. So now we can apply our own spiritual practice, our own experiences, to what is here. And it says here that soul possesses its perfection in a transition and interval of life. Well, we know that our study of philosophy in general is to perfect our soul, to become healthier, to become wiser, to perfect the virtues as Plato presented them. And by the way, for those of you who have not seen it, I do have a video on the virtues. It's in the introductory playlist. I lost the word there for a minute here. Okay, so a transition. So we're going through change. So hopefully we're changing to the better. Some people, of course, change for the worse, but we see that soul can go through change. Some people become healthier, some become more unhealthy. We also see that we have an interval of life. We don't experience eternity as one whole. We are in one piece of time, one very small slice. One human life is just one small slice of time, and we experience it in moments, in interval. But we see that whatever it is that we are depending on here, it says it depends on another more ancient cause. Whatever that cause is, it is more ancient. And remember that in metaphysics, when we talk about something being prior to or ancient or before, it's not really in time. We have to expand our vocabulary, our use of this word, to mean it's a power that is greater in the cause of that which is subsequent. Also the same with spatial words like above or beyond or higher. So we know that we're looking for a cause that is more ancient or before. It subsists according to sameness. It doesn't go through the transition that our souls go through. And rather than having its life in intervals, as we experience it, it is in eternity. Now, to see this relationship of these two realms, I think it would be helpful to look at the myth that Plato presented in The Statesman. I do have this myth in greater detail in my videos on The Statesman. It's in the playlist for the late dialogues for those of you interested, but I'm going to pull out a few passages from it that will fit what we're doing here today. And he's talking here about what he calls the era of Chronos and the era of Zeus. Now, just a few words on myth in general is that we're personifying divine forces and looking at how they blend together, how they function when put together. So in general, when you see siblings, that means they're of the same generation, they're of the same power. Because of course, we're not talking about time, of course. We're not talking about actual age. They're not actually separated by time or space. So siblings are of the same generation, of the same power, the same realm, if you will. Married couples in general, or whenever there's a coupling of two gods or a god with a human, it's a mingling of energies. And here we have Chronos as the father and Zeus as the son. When you have different generations, then of course the older is the more ancient. And so it's a higher, more powerful cause. And so we're seeing how these two intellects, they're both intellect, Chronos and Zeus, they're both intellects, but of different powers. And so Chronos is a more ancient cause than Zeus, and we're going to see how they blend together. So he says, ever to be the same, steadfast and abiding, is the prerogative of the divinest of things only. The nature of the bodily does not entitle it to this rank. Now the heaven, or the universe as we've chosen to call it, and by the way, heaven is not used in the Christian sense of the afterworld. For the Greeks here, heaven is the physical manifestation, or the physical realm. And so this physical realm has received many blessed gifts from him who has brought it into being. But it has also been made to partake of bodily form. Hence, it is impossible that it should abide forever free from change. And yet, as far as may be, its movement is uniform, invariable, and in one place. Thus it is that it has received from God a rotation in reverse, the least possible variation of its proper motion. So it receives its power from its higher cause. To revolve ever in the same belongs to none but the Lord and leader of all things that move. And even he cannot move the universe now in one sense and now in the other, for this would flout eternal decrees. By the way, just as a side note here, the word for same is auto, which also means self. And if you were to plug in self, you would have something very much consistent with Hinduism, Buddhism, or any other wisdom tradition that talks of the self. To revolve ever in the self belongs to none but the Lord and leader of all things that move. For our context, we're talking about that invariable motion, and so we leave it as same, but that it does open up an interesting train of thought and something to think about. Okay, well, now we bring in the eras. So in the one era, it is assisted, let me start over. In the one era, it is assisted on its way by the transcendent divine cause, and that's Chronos, receiving a renewal of life from its creator, an immortality of his contriving. But in the other era, in the era of Zeus, when it has been released, it moves by its innate force. And so we see these two intellects here. So Zeus is Nous that reigns over our physical world. He is in mythology the god who rules over the physical world. And he's associated with soul, the Nous that soul participates in. Whereas his father, Chronos, is a more divine intellect, the intelligible intellect. And we see that Zeus has his own innate powers, and also he participates in the higher, and he gets his power from the higher. So coming back here, we see Zeus related with the self-motive cause of soul, and his father, Chronos, is the intellect that is immovable, the divine intellect. So now we have these two, and now we just want to get the bottom two. We want to assign those also to realms of reality. So going back to Proclass now. He says that all bodies, all physical bodies, belong to those things which are naturally moved only, and they are passive, for they are productive of nothing on account of possessing a hypostasis that is endued with interval time, in participating of magnitude and bulk, so the realm of space. And so moved only, we're going to give to the realm of matter, which then begs the question of what comes between them. If soul is what moves things and matter is what is moved, why would there be something in between? So what is this realm that both moves and is moved? What is the distinction that Proclass is going to make that separates this from soul or from matter? Well, here's what he says about it. So matter is the only corporeal realm, and then everything above that is incorporeal. And of the incorporeal natures, some are divisible about bodies, whereas others are exempt or transcendent from such a division about the last of things being matter. Those incorporeals, therefore, which are divisible about the bulks of bodies, whether they subsist in qualities or in material forms, they belong to the number of things moved by another, but at the same time moving others. And for these, because they possess an incorporeal allotment, they do participate of a mode of power. But because they are divided about bodies, they're deprived of the power of verging to themselves and are divided together with their subjects. So here we're separating those energies of, say, like what gives animals movement or plants to grow, that energy that gives life, and it is incorporeal, but it's not like the rational soul that can participate in nous. And so coming back here, there are different names that different philosophers might give these. Is this irrational soul, or are there other energies even lesser in power, such as what plants participate in? Do they participate in soul, or is it some other kind of energy? There's some debate, and there's quite a bit of interesting literature on that. But in general, this realm is what we'll call nature. So we have 4 realms here: intellect, soul, nature, and matter, matching up to these then 4 hypostases of motion. So now what we want to do is really appreciate how these 4 hypostases of motion, how these 4 realms with these motions all interact with one another in our physical world. So now what I want to do is go back to that excerpt I gave earlier when I introduced the self-motive, because now we want to understand the second half of this particular quote here. He says that about soul, that through its own motion, it imparts the representation of being moved to other things. So what does that mean? Let's see what he says about it. He says that all inanimate natures are alone alter motive, and whatever they suffer, whatever they passively experience, they are adapted to suffer through a certain power externally moving and compelling. Again, the way I can move this glass, it only moves if I move it. If it danced around like a Disney cartoon, I would freak out. It remains, therefore, that animated nature, such as the human body, must possess this representation, and they are self-motive only in a secondary degree. Now, this is something a lot of people coming to Platonism, coming to Platonic metaphysics, really struggle with. The idea that our bodies are not moving themselves. It is the soul that is moving the body. And of course, when the soul is separated from the body, it's a corpse. If it moved, that's the stuff of horror movies. And so that's what he's talking about here. It is actually the soul moving the body, and it only appears as though the body is self-moving. He goes on to say that the soul which is in these bodies primarily moves itself and is moved by itself, and through a power derived from itself as it imparts life to bodies. So likewise, it extends to bodies from itself a representation or appearance of being moved by themselves. If, therefore, the self-motive essence is more ancient than alter-motive natures, but soul is primarily self-motive, from which the image of self-motion is imparted to bodies, then soul will be beyond, metaphysically speaking, beyond bodies, and the motion of every body will be the progeny of soul and the motion that it contains. Hence it is necessary that the whole heaven and all the bodies it contains, possessing various motions and being moved with different motions, should all have ruling souls. I'm going to stop for a moment, because what we're seeing here is that Proclass is extending this to its fullest implication. It's not just that humans move because we have soul, but it's the whole heaven, all the bodies it contains. They all have ruling souls, which are essentially more ancient than bodies, and which are moved in themselves and supernally illuminate these with the power of being moved. And this is why many ancients then worship or pray to the sun or the moon, the planets as gods. It's not that they're worshiping a rock floating in space, it's that they're recognizing the ruling soul that is associated with that floating rock. And we can also see then that this also carries to every body within the physical realm. And remember, the heaven is not, it means the physical realm. It's not the afterworld. In the dialogue Phaedrus, Plato presents a myth where he shows human souls following their ruling god, their ruling soul. And so that's also captured here as well. And so this idea that there is this relationship between the physical and our souls that as we know them in our physical world, and also they have these ruling souls. It is also necessary that the soul, which is essentialized according to reason. Last week, and I did a video on being in essence, I introduced the Greek word ousia for essence, and that is that dynamic power of, or that dynamic movement and power in the divine realm. This word essentialized, you could read as ousiaized. And reason here, I believe, is nous. So we're saying that souls are ousiaized according to nous. And it is necessary that such a soul should possess that which pertains to intellect through participation, and that the intellectual nature should be twofold. And this twofold nature then is the one subsisting primarily in a divine intellect itself, and that is the era of Chronos, but the other which proceeds from this, subsisting secondarily in soul, and that's the era of Zeus. And so now we're seeing all of it put together. He says soul is self-motive, binding in itself all corporeal motions. And prior to this is intellect, which is immovable. So again, putting it all together. Through these causes also, the world is denominated by Timaeus, in the dialogue Timaeus. It's denominated an animal endued with soul and intellect, being called by him an animal according to its own nature, and the life pervading to it from soul, in which is distributed about it. But the heaven, this physical manifestation, is animated or endued with soul according to the presence of a divine soul in it. And it's endued with intellect according to intellectual domination. For the supply of life, the government of soul, because remember, soul again is that principle of motion. Zeus is the god in mythology who reigns over the physical world. And the government of soul and the participation of intellect connect and contain the whole of heaven. And so there you see the four hypostases of motion all functioning together in our beautiful physical world. If you have any questions about anything that I covered here, please feel free to leave a comment, or also there is an email address at the bottom of the description box. So if you have a question that you want a response to, feel free to write to me. If you like this kind of content, if you found this video helpful, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. And if you don't already subscribe, I hope you'll think about it, because I do put out videos each week and you'll get a notification if you subscribe. Either way, I do hope that you will join me next week. Thank you very much.